All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Um, Welcome everyone to this webinar on understanding the governor's budget. We are recording this webinar and we'll share the slides and recording with everyone who registered. We are aiming to leave at least 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. So you can submit your questions at any time using the Q&A feature in Zoom, or if you prefer to ask your question verbally, when we get to that part of the program, you can raise your hand and we will attempt to unmute you. My name is Benjamin Orr. I'm the President, CEO of the Maryland Center on Economic Policy. For those of you who are not familiar with us, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank that believes every Marylander should be able to achieve their full potential in a healthy economy that offers a widely shared and rising standard of living. And in addition to a wide variety of relationships across the state, we also are part of several national networks, including the Kids Count Network, the State Priorities Partnership, and the Economic Analysis Research Network, or EARN. We want to start with a little bit of a background on the budget, big picture. Some of you may have heard this before, but it may be new for others of you. Why do we care about budgets? Well, budgets are a reflection of our values. So they're where action actually meets rhetoric. And what the decisions that we make through fiscal and economic policy are a matter of justice because they have such deep impacts on our daily lives in our communities. In terms of the budget process, we are kind of in the middle of this process. We're going to see this slide again later in the presentation. So I just right now want to tell you where we are. You can orient yourself to the red arrow. And the governor has introduced his budget, and the Department of Legislative Services has done their fiscal briefing. So we've gotten the big picture analysis, and we are now ourselves going through and analyzing the budget. The Department of Legislative Services, or DLS, is doing their more close reading of the budget, and the legislative budget committees are beginning to hold hearings. The DLS analyses will give a much more detailed information about each section of the budget, each agency, and in a way that we don't yet have because the budget documents themselves are fairly high level, even though they're many hundreds of pages long, and don't always provide the detail that you may be interested in to understand the impact on smaller programs or programs that you care about. So we'll come back to this slide in a little bit and talk about next steps. In general, this is what we're looking at here is our operating budget. I want to note that the charts you're looking at that we're showing you today are not, this chart and the next chart are not about the proposal that's in front of us. They're about prior year budgets, but the how our spending is allocated in the big picture doesn't really change very much year to year. So we spend most of our funding on education. If you put K through 12 and higher education together, followed very closely by healthcare and other health expenses. Human services make up about 10%, transportation a little bit less than that, public safety down to 5% of our overall $60 billion budget or $63 billion budget. And this operating budget really is how we do things. And it's how we pay for most of the programs that you're going to care about in your day-to-day work or lives. The other important piece here is that the operating budget is paid for through revenues that we collect currently. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. If we look at the other component of the budget, that's the capital budget. This is where we build things. And for the most part, this is funded with debt. We take out bonds to pay for long-term investments like buildings or roads or transit networks and many other things. And you can kind of see how that breaks down here. A lot of it gets spent on K through 12 education, whether it's building a new elementary school or something like that. But a lot of the spending shows up here. If we look at the transportation budget component of this, a good chunk of this will sometimes be reflected in the operating budget, and you'll sometimes see where folks will talk about the capital budget being paid for with PAYGO dollars. That's an example of when the capital investments are paid for with current revenues instead of debt. So if you hear the word PAYGO, that's what that means. Let's switch to, and the PAYGO will show up in the operating budget. When we talk about our expenditures, that's only half the picture. So let's look at the other half of the picture. How do we pay for these things? And when we look at revenue, this is the breakdown from FY22. I will say that this slightly overstates the share of federal funds flowing through the state budget. We were still getting a lot of pandemic relief dollars when this in the year that this slide reflects, but federal funds always make up a significant portion of our revenue that the state has available to use. That's closely followed by the individual income tax and the sales tax as the two other biggest parts of our revenue system. So taxes you and I pay. Corporate income tax is only 3% of the state's revenues. Higher education has its own source of revenues that make up 8% of the total revenue package for the state. Things like grants and tuition and things like that. And there's a whole host of other pieces. So hopefully that gives you a sense of kind of the big picture overview of the governor's of the budget every year. Now let's talk about what the governor has proposed for this year. Governor Moore has proposed a $63 billion budget for the next budget year that starts July 1st. So it ends in June of 2025. So we call it the fiscal year 2025 budget. And that's about $1 billion less than the current budget. Again, partly because of the loss of federal dollars, but we're going to talk about some other things that are in here as well. The governor the governor is always required to introduce a balanced budget. And in preparing the budget, he faced a $761 million structural deficit, a difference between our revenues and our expected expenses. And so he took a number of actions to balance the budget. The first thing he did is he took one-time funds from our reserves and interest and also interest payments that would have normally gone into some special funds. So this is like living off of our savings. He also increased some types of fees, particularly MVA fees, parking fees at the airport, BWI, and also some environmental fees that certain types of businesses pay. And he also found areas in the budget to cut spending. There's a couple of major reductions, but primarily what we see in this budget proposal is smaller cuts, or in other cases, he returned funding to pre-pandemic levels. So he might not have cut below that level, but he certainly isn't spending at the same level that we were during the pandemic. So while the proposed budget is balanced because of these actions, as required by our state constitution, it makes few long-term changes to public services or revenue that really are what we need to address the long-term imbalance in the budget. So here is a slide from the Department of Legislative Services, or DLS. When we talk about structural deficit, what we're talking about is that our expenses are increasing faster than our revenues are increasing. And so over time, they start to separate, and that's what you see here. So you're seeing the administration's estimates and DLS's estimates here over the next 5 budget cycles. And the state analysts forecast that the deficit will reach $3 billion in fiscal year 2029. And we have to address that. Because of the challenges that the current and future budget are under, the governor did not propose any new major investments, but he did make room for a few, about $390 million in new spending, primarily on unplanned costs. So we're putting up this is a list of some of those increases. There were some unplanned costs for the metro system and for state employee pay increases that were negotiated. And there's a few modest spending increases on new initiatives like improving the $14 million for gun violence prevention and the Enough Act that it was just announced, but not very large in the context of a $63 billion budget. So let's dive into each of the major areas of the budget's, the governor's proposal. And the first big area, of course, is education. So public schools and the current funding requirements of the Blueprint for Maryland's Future do appear to be fully funded in this budget. There are some changes to parts of the education formula that we're still trying to find out more about. We're not sure if they're due to enrollment declines or something else, so we're still trying to gather information about that. However, again, while the blueprint is fully funded for the next couple of years, because of the dedicated funding sources policymakers have created, as well as some of the one-time funding that's been set aside during the last 2 years, it will need additional funding to maintain this commitment in the 2026 and 2027 school year. Will be the first year where we're really facing that challenge. There are significant cuts in this budget to community college funding that total nearly $23 million across all community colleges in the state. And these are, the governor's proposing these not be one-time reductions. There is companion legislation to the budget. You'll sometimes hear it called the BRFA, which stands for Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act. And in that, the governor is proposing changes to the formula the state uses to determine community college funding, which would have which would codify these cuts in state law. There are also cuts in funding for students attending private colleges and universities in the state, which total $63 million in cuts. The governor's proposal, it focuses this cut in aid on graduate programs. So he's proposing to realize these savings by focusing on undergraduate programs. And this also is proposed as a long-term change to the funding formula. Let's shift to health. The good news is that the governor proposes funding a 3% increase in reimbursement rates for providers who offer Medicaid-funded services. Medicaid, of course, is the health insurance program for lower-income Marylanders. And this is important to help those providers keep up with the rising cost of serving Medicaid patients and to retain providers within the network. Medicaid is the largest component of health spending in Maryland and is funded with a mix of federal and state dollars. Enrollment is trending downward significantly as the temporary pandemic freeze on Medicaid rolls has been lifted, and people who are the state believes are no longer eligible have been disenrolled. We are concerned, as well as other health advocates are concerned, that this disenrollment process has led to thousands of Marylanders losing Medicaid for procedural reasons. Essentially, they didn't complete the renewal process, even though they may still be eligible. If you didn't complete the process, even if you're eligible, you get dropped. So this is something that we're keeping an eye on. I know many of you are as well. There's also the Department of Legislative Services flagged some discrepancies in the Moore administration's estimates for Medicaid enrollment. And so we think there may be potentially additional changes to the Medicaid budget as the General Assembly gathers information, works through the budget, and compares their numbers with the administration's numbers and decides what to do with that discrepancy. One area where we see a particular structural deficiency is in the state's Emergency Medical Services Fund. This budget does not address that structural deficit, although again, it's balanced overall. This is a weakness within it. The fund is used to provide some state support for local emergency services, and it looks like there's a $16 million deficit in fiscal year 2026 that grows slightly in future years. So this is a specific area we want to call out. Returning to more positive news, the budget does fund new staff and technology needed to implement the state's family and medical leave insurance program, which will begin offering benefits in 2026. So we are excited for that to finally get off the ground and start making a difference for folks who need that benefit. In terms of housing, the governor has made housing affordability one of his top priorities and has several bills on the topic. However, his mechanisms for addressing housing affordability are largely not in the operating budget. They're through policy changes. His budget does include an increase in capital funds for affordable housing construction, which will typically come in the form of grants or loans to nonprofit developers. There is also a small amount of operating funds, about $500,000 set aside to create the proposed new Office of Tenants' Rights. So we'll be keeping an eye on that. MDCEP and other housing advocates are calling on the legislature to allocate some funds for eviction prevention, which Maryland has not historically invested in, but was highly effective at keeping families in their homes during the pandemic. So you may recall a couple of years ago, last year, the legislature did gain the ability to add to the governor's budget so long as it remains balanced. And so this is an area where advocates, including this organization, are asking for some new investment. In terms of transportation, excuse me. So most of the things that we've been discussing so far are in the governor's operating budget proposal. Transportation, as we mentioned, is separate. It's funded from the Transportation Trust Fund and bonds for construction projects and repairs. The governor announced back in the fall that there was a significant fund imbalance and therefore a need for major cuts in transportation projects. Ultimately, they were able to avoid the most severe cuts through one-time actions, but the Maryland Transit Administration is still proposing cuts to commuter bus service, and some local construction projects may be delayed. There's still an average gap of about $420 million a year between ongoing commitments and funding in the capital budget that could further reduce transit service or maintenance as well. And we may, many of you may recall, we had to shut down the light rail system last year for a little while to deal with some deferred maintenance. We also may see delays in road construction projects. I know last time we did this, we did something, had a similar conversation. There were questions about the red line. This transportation budget, this issue with the transportation budget long-term is before accounting for any major new projects that aren't already in the 5-year transportation plan, such as the red line. So the red line is not in the transportation plan yet, and so therefore is not reflected in these numbers. There is a legislative commission that's reviewing options to address the state's transportation needs, so that may be an avenue outside of the budget process where those of you who are concerned about transportation may want to weigh in or make your voice heard. Next slide, let's focus on family income supports. So I think one of the big areas here is in childcare scholarships, scholarships for parents to purchase childcare with. And the governor has put significant new funding into this program of about $270 million. But the program also has an uncertain future in out years. The State Department of Education runs the program and notified legislators that it may reinstate copays, which can be hundreds of dollars per month for some families. It got rid of copays, I believe, at the beginning of the pandemic, but now it wants to reinstate them potentially. The BRFA, that legislation that accompanies the budget, also includes language that would allow the state to again establish waiting lists for the program in the future, rather than funding all families who meet the eligibility criteria. And so we don't want to necessarily return to an era of waiting lists in a new program, another program. The budget does maintain the additional $45 a month for families that receive temporary cash assistance that began in 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic. That is important for those families. It's also insufficient. As some of you may be aware, the state publishes a minimum, what's called the Maryland minimum living level every year. And right now, if you look at TCA plus SNAP or food assistance, those two programs combined only account for about 61% of the minimum living level. So we're not even supporting families at the lowest end of the economy at that minimum living level. There's no increase in food assistance in the governor's budget, but there are several bills separately that are proposing an increase in the minimum benefit, which is currently $40 a month. The legislature could, again, add this to the budget if they cut from other areas, and so that it remains balanced. There's also not quite $20 million set aside to fund the program that was created to replace stolen benefits. That also is a program that is not clear it will be funded in the future. This may be a one-time funding increase. When we look at the state's workforce, the people that are entrusted with implementing this budget, state agencies have been severely understaffed for years, and the state has had challenges filling open positions in even when it is hiring. This affects the experiences that Marylanders have when they interact with state agencies and makes it harder for state agencies to provide the level of service they want to. And so the budget does try to improve the situation by funding a 3% pay increase for state employees and for some other enhancements and bonuses to help with recruiting and retention, particularly focused on the most understaffed agencies. There have been some signs of improvement since Governor Moore took office, but the average vacancy rate across most agencies is still 11%. We also sometimes see agencies leaving funded positions open longer so that they save money. The Hogan administration did this consistently, so that's something else we'll be watching. And then I think last but not least, the area we wanted to share a little bit about is on public safety. So there are several new gun violence prevention initiatives that the governor is proposing. There's a $10 million for a new Center for Firearm Violence Prevention and Intervention, $4 million for a Thrive Academy gun violence prevention program. So we'll see what the legislature thinks of those. There's also $12 million in increased funding for services for youth interacting with the juvenile justice system, and an increase in aid to local police departments. So Those are the big areas of the budget, and let's talk about next steps and what you can do to influence the budget decisions that the General Assembly is making now. So again, we are in the legislative session. And right now that the budget has been introduced and we've had the fiscal briefing, the Maryland General Assembly, or MGA, is considering it, and it's going through budget hearings for every agency. Pay attention to those agency hearings for the programs you care about. And those are opportunities for advocacy. We're also awaiting the March revenue estimate in maybe 6 weeks from now, which will impact what the bottom line is that we need to hit in order to pass a balanced budget. We may see some supplemental budgets from the governor. This is a tool that Governor Moore is probably less likely to use than Governor Hogan was, but I wouldn't be surprised if, for example, around Medicaid, if the administration and the General Assembly can come to an agreement about what the numbers actually are around enrollment, they may have a revision around Medicaid, for example. And ultimately, then the General Assembly will adopt the budget and any the BRFA, if they decide they approve of the items in the BRFA, and then the governor will have an opportunity, if he wants, to make line item vetoes to that budget, and the legislature could potentially override those vetoes. The other thing that I am closely following here is the federal budget, which again, lots of federal dollars flow through to the states, including Maryland. The federal budget is not done yet, and despite incremental progress, we're still under continuing resolutions through the beginning of March. And so that's also another piece to keep an eye on as we move through the budget process. In terms of advocacy, you have a number of opportunities. You have the legislature now has more budget power than they used to, so your advocacy can really make a difference here. This is really the time to think about submitting written testimony to the relevant committees or speaking at a hearing. You want to follow closely when the Department of Legislative Services releases its analysis of that agency's budget. There'll be lots of really good information in there just prior to the agency hearing. And if there's a budget issue that you care about, talk to your legislators that represent you in Annapolis, and also think about reaching out to the relevant budget committee members, especially if you're representing an organization. That can be a particularly powerful message for them to hear. You may hear, and you can see the committees that we're talking about on the screen there. So whether it's in the Senate or the House, all of those committees are relevant to this debate. You may get some pushback from legislators that tell you there isn't money for something, but don't let that deter you from asking or raising issues that are important to your community. And it isn't the be all end all of the debate. We need to talk about not just our spending, but also our revenue. And so many of the actions that the governor took or the legislature is about to take to balance the budget this year can't be repeated. And so with this long-term structural deficit, we really face a choice between raising revenue or cutting services and putting off any new initiatives or programs. So this is really the choice we have in front of us. So I want to run quickly through some key points about our tax system as you're paying attention to the debate in Annapolis. Here's a few things that we want you to keep in mind. For the first thing is that Maryland's tax system is unremarkable. That really, when we look at state and local taxes and including fees and fines or other types of charges, as a share of our personal income, we're basically in the middle of the pack. So this darker line that you see here in this graph is Maryland. Just to its right is the United States overall numbers, and we're right there, middle of the pack. The other outlines are for the states that surround us, and you can see they're kind of spread out. The far left is the District of Columbia, but the other states are really quite close to us. So I would say that our tax system is unremarkable in many ways. The next piece of information I think that's important to understand is that not everybody pays their fair share. Our tax system is upside down. So recent analysis by the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, and actually I'm realizing this is the older data. We have an updated report for this slide, which we will swap out when we send the slides out, but the story is the same. The wealthiest Marylanders, the Marylanders who make the most, are paying the smallest share of their income in state and local taxes, and those at the bottom are paying the most. So I think in the current iteration of this data, if you're in the top 1%, all the way on the right-hand side there, you're making more than $750,000 a year. If you're all the way on the left, you're making less than $34,000 a year and paying a greater share of your income in state and local taxes. So our system's upside down. Next slide. In terms of business taxes, same story. Not terribly remarkable, or if they are, in many ways, they're quite good for business. Business taxes are a much smaller share of our economy than in most other states. You can see Maryland all the way on the right, the dark blue at 4.2%, whereas the United States average is 4.9%, and all of our neighbors are much higher as a share of the economy. This is data from Ernst & Young. They do a report for the Council on State Taxation, or COST. COST is a business lobbying group. And in addition to this particular graph, they also find in that same report that Maryland businesses get a return on their tax dollar of 143%, $1.43 back for every dollar they spend in the state on taxes. They don't literally get $1.43 back. They get it back in terms of lower training costs because we have an excellent educational system. We invest in roads and courts and all sorts of other things that businesses benefit from. And so that's money they don't have to spend themselves. And so that's how they get that return. But it is remarkable, and Maryland is very unique in terms of the size of the benefit that it gives to that businesses earn for their tax dollar, is one way to say that. Next slide. So our tax system is upside down and not fair in many ways, and isn't raising the revenue that we need in order to maintain, let alone implement new programs that benefit all our communities. There is a plan for how to fix it, called the Fair Share Plan for Maryland, the Fair Share for Maryland plan, if you want. And so here you can see the outlines of this plan. It raises $1.6 billion a year in revenue in order to close that structural deficit and support good schools and healthcare, transportation, and other high quality services in the workforce needed to deliver those services. It actually would cut taxes for Marylanders with families' incomes of less than $106,000. And would boost working families' incomes through the earned income tax credit, child tax credit expansion. It would ensure that the wealthiest 1%, again, those making, I said $750,000 more, it's actually $775,000 a year or more, making sure that they pay their fair share. And we're not making, large ask of them. We're asking them for an average increase in their taxes of less than 1% of their income. It also would level the playing field for small local businesses, really the drivers of our local economy, who have are at a disadvantage when it comes to their large multi-state competitors. So the mom and pop sandwich shop on the corner can't engage in the same accounting tricks that the corporate chain around the block can. And so we're asking them to pay their fair share that would level the playing field for small local business. And we also believe that this plan would advance economic and racial justice by addressing aspects of Maryland's tax system that disproportionately benefit wealthy white households at the expense of Marylanders of color. I think in the next slide, we have, we're throwing some links in the chat, and we'll share those afterwards as well. But you can see here the impact of the Fair Share for Maryland plan. You can find yourself in that income breakdown here, but you can see folks making less than 106, households making less than $106,000 a year would see some sort of tax break concentrated among the bottom 20% of taxpayers making less than $34,000 a year. And the net increase in the reforms that we're suggesting would be focused on the top 5%, and particularly the top 1% of Marylanders, those making more than $770,000 a year. So we do have some polling around these tax plans. 70% of Marylanders support this plan, and the support is bipartisan, although Democrats do support it at a higher level. You can find out more by going to fairsharemaryland.org. And so with that, we'll conclude the presentation and look for, looks like we have a few questions in the chat in the Q&A section, and I'm going to pull those up so I can start looking through those. And yes, the slides will be available. All right, so there is a question, and Chris, I might turn this over to you to answer. Question is, how do we know, do we know which or what community college programs would be impacted? Chris is our research analyst here at MedCep and is our resident expert on the education budget, among other things.
Thanks for that question. So the aid that the state gives to community colleges is essentially just general aid. So in terms of how those programs will be affected, that's something that each community college will essentially determine on its own. The budget books do include a table of the total funding for each community college, although I'm not certain whether this table is after those cuts or before the cuts because they require legislation. I will post a link to that in the chat. But yeah, essentially that's something that each community college will figure out on its own. It's sort of a sink or swim approach, but you could certainly imagine things like reduced programming, lower staffing, etc., that would be harmful to students.
Chris, is that is each community college being cut by the same amount or by a percentage of their budget, state support? How is that distributed across the 24 counties?
I'm not certain of the answer to that. I can try to get you that information. My guess would be that it's a flat percentage cut, but I'm not certain.
That's what I was thinking too. I don't think it's going to be a flat dollar amount. It's going to be a flat percentage. Sorry. Okay. So the next question we have is around the Biden infrastructure bill and how that might impact our budget. Are you talking about the infrastructure bill that already passed? Was that last year, or are you talking about something in the future? I guess is the question for our for Trina. If you could even unmute yourself and clarify the question. if you're still with us. Or throw a clarification in the chat. So if we're talking about the Biden infrastructure bill that already passed, Callie or Chris, you might know this better than I do, but I believe most of that has been allocated to a number of programs in there were competitive. I think there's a fair amount of climate change related dollars that are still available, but go ahead.
I'm not sure how much is still available. I think the idea is it would be available for a number of years, and I believe the state has applied for some funding. But again, it's competitive or competing with other states. So I think to the extent that the state expects to receive any of that funding so far, that is reflected in the budget. There might be other opportunities in the future as that continues to roll out. But the federal funds are already reflected in the budget as it stands now.
Okay, and Callie, this might be a question for you as well. In terms of the Fair Share for Maryland Act, the question is what strategies will be most effective in passing this as we're trying to close the structural deficit and make sure that we're fully funding the services Marylanders need.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. I think, number one, legislators, we have polling that shows that, as Ben was saying earlier, that the vast majority of Marylanders support this approach and want to make our tax system more equitable and ensure that we have the money that we need to support all the important things that the state does. But it always helps for legislators to hear that directly from their constituents, and from organizations that they have relationships with. So definitely share your support with your elected legislators. If you go to the website link that was shared in the chat earlier, you can also sign up as an individual or an organization to be part of the coalition that is working on this bill. And there will be email communication going out to everyone on that list about opportunities for the best moments to send emails to legislators showing support. And there's also more details on the plans and information that can help you in talking to legislators about them. That's the coalition also has social media pages, so that's another good way to just help spread the word and show support and show the range of voices that are supporting these proposals. So those are they are on Instagram, Twitter or X, and Facebook. That's all at Fair Share Maryland is the handle for all of those.
Thanks, Callie. Well, we've run out of questions. So feel free, if you've got one burning question, raise your hand or throw it in the Q&A. And I will just say that we really appreciate everybody attending today. And that I do see the question there. I just wanted to flag, I asked Chris to answer a question specifically about the education budget. Chris is our education and workforce and tax policy expert. Also on this call, other folks on the team, Jasmine Aramburu and Nanso Muna are our human services kind of focused budget analysts. Musab Ibrahim is focused on criminal justice, and Tanika Richardson is our health and housing analyst. So certainly feel free to reach out to us if there are additional more detailed questions. In the chat, I see a question, and actually, Trina, you raised your hand, so I'll let you say your question. I think you can unmute yourself now. I figured out how to do that.
Hello, hi, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, we lost you again.
I was, what I asked earlier, how would can you hear me now?
Yes, you keep
Hello?
coming in and out for some reason, but we do hear you.
Okay.
Are you asking the same question in this in the chat?
My question is, how would the Biden infrastructure bill impact? Yes,
Okay. We might need to follow up offline about the transportation bill. In terms of the other question that you asked about how do we continue your relationship with us, certainly check out our website at mdeconomy.org. You can sign up for our mailing list. You can follow our social media. We have a blog and a podcast where we'll continue to put out information about the budget as we continue to learn it. Those are some of the best ways to stay in touch. We'll certainly be sending out an email to everyone who registered to this webinar afterwards with a lot of that information as well as the slides and presentation. Okay, and Chris, I'm going to turn to you again because we have another education funding question. Would love to hear more about the statutory changes to the funding formula that are being proposed and that are likely filed in the BRFA.
I think that's something I'm going to have to follow up afterward with you about, Frank.
Okay. We will do that. And certainly if other folks have that same question, let us know. The next question is about SNAP. It just disappeared on me. Oh, there it is. So what is the status of the 3 SNAP benefit bills? My group is extremely concerned that the governor did not put in increases to his budget. What do we think is the status of those bills? Jasmine, am I recalling correctly that you have been attending those meetings? Or Callie or Kevin, if you want to jump in.
So in terms of the status, I can put some of the bills in the chat, but I know that there's upcoming hearings next week. And yeah, I would encourage your organizations to submit testimony, encouraging the for the passing of those bills. I don't know if there's Kelly, if you have, or Kevin, if you have information about the actual
Yeah,
like what they're saying about that, in terms of how feasible it is for those to pass.
It may be difficult, but the primary goal objective is to raise it from 60, the benefit for all from 60 to 75. That's the primary focus. So support is definitely welcome.
We certainly have had examples in the past of personal stories making a difference around SNAP specifically. I think the last question I see in the chat, and then unless I see more, we'll wrap up. I think that there really is a chance here to move some, if not all of these revenue bills across the finish line this year. These are bills that we've been working on, the coalition has been working on for many years. The legislature knows that they can't keep kicking the can down the road. They've been doing that for a while, and we're running out of road. And we also know that that because there's overwhelming support among Marylanders, because some of these reforms that we're talking about are bipartisan in nature, where we see, for example, the corporate tax reforms that we're looking at, the majority of states already have, red and blue. Maryland just hasn't closed this loophole yet. So we think that they have a strong chance of passing this year. We'll see where we are on sine die, but I think that if they don't pass these this tax package, they know that they're going to have to make cuts and to go back on their commitment to the Blueprint for Maryland's Prosperity and other programs, and they don't want to do that. So I'm optimistic, but it is going to be it's going to take hard work from all of us. So there we go. So and yes, it's a good reminder. Even though the hearing for the SNAP bill is next week, the deadline for signing up will be significantly in advance of that, whether it's today or what have you. Do pay attention to those deadlines as they sometimes can catch people up, that you have to get it in so far ahead in advance. I think Callie's going to throw, or no, okay. So we will be following up with all of the materials that we've been talking about. I really appreciate everyone's time, and hope that you have a good lunch and have a good rest of your day, and thank you again.